Welcome to the Holywell Music Room, which, as many of you will know, is the oldest purpose-built concert hall in Europe, or is believed to be so, and is part of a jealously guarded and much admired part of Wadham College, which actually some people don't know. Before I say anything more, a couple of housekeeping things. If we have to leave in an emergency, then the way out of this building is the way you came in. And can I remind you to put your phones on silent or turn them off or airplane mode or whatever. Okay, this evening's event is going to be in 3 parts. There will be, and will last probably of the order of an hour or an hour and a quarter, not longer than that, and there will be no interval. So it will start with a short musical performance. We will then have something like 25 minutes of conversation, and we would be very pleased to have audience comments and questions and so on towards the end of that period. And then there will be a third part, which will again be a number of short musical performances. There is no cost of entry here, but if you wish to make a donation towards the costs of the event, then on the way out or in, you will have noticed that there is a QR code that you can use to transfer money to an account, or a wicker basket that you can put cash in if you happen to be someone who carries cash around. Okay, but without further ado then, please, and actually, given that it will be quite conversational, if any of you did want to move nearer to the front, now would be an appropriate moment to do so, also we are. But please join me in welcoming Jessica Miskelly and Ilya Chetverikov to the stage.
to come and join us today. It's a real joy to get to be here and to perform in Holywell this evening. The piece that I just performed, the Paganini, is special to me for several reasons, one of which is I first heard it performed live in this hall about 5 years ago, and I fell in love with it and thought I have to learn that one day. And that one day came during lockdown when I picked up the piece at a time that was very difficult for me personally on many levels, and the piece helped to bring me back into a season of music again. But also during that time of lockdown, as many of us were likely doing, I was reading the headlines and I was full of grief at the division that I was seeing from every quarter. And my heart was broken, and I just started to ask the question, is there a small way that perhaps music can help our attempt to come together and discuss things that are difficult, and to use the act of music making as a bit of a metaphor for how we engage with each other in the act of conversation. When two musicians are up here on the stage, it's very much like a nonverbal dialogue that's going on. And I thought perhaps there might be some lessons that we can draw, some examples and some inspiration maybe, to look at how we communicate with each other through the lens of music. And here to explore that question with me, I'm delighted to have Professor Eric Clarke. Thank you for enabling this evening to happen. And delighted to be joined by friend and colleague Jessica RONNEVIK over from the US on viola. So, if I might invite both of you up onto the stage to transition into a bit of conversation and demonstration. So, when we, would you like to join? Yep. Thank you. When we engage in conversation, we all know that one of the most important things that we need to do is to listen. And even though we know this, we still find it to be a difficult thing. And so, I just thought it might be rather interesting and maybe a bit entertaining to be able to observe what we look like and what we sound like when we engage in conversation and are not actually trying to hear what the other person is saying. So, here to demo that with me is Jessica, who is looking for an important piece of equipment, without which, where the hell? Oh, okay. All right, so, what you're about to see is us trying to play a small section of music, but with sound-canceling headphones in my case, and earplugs. Now that might have been apparent, that it didn't go so well. And it's just a very overt way of making the point that we can come to a conversation about difficult things, we can come with things to say and to share, but if we aren't actually willing to take on board what the other person is bringing and sharing and truly listening and locking in and trying to engage, it's kind of a useless exercise to even begin the conversation. So let's play that same passage again. And this time, without obstruction. hopefully inspire us that, you know, we do have agency in our day-to-day lives, whether it's personal or professional in context. The act of listening can make all of the difference in whether there is an actual coming together and creating something that is useful and beautiful.
And striking, as perhaps you noticed, that the kind of body movement of these two players was extremely different when they are actually listening to each other and interacting in this kind of actually engaged fashion. Much more body movement, much more flexible body movement, a kind of feeling of something actually happening rather than two isolated individuals.
Yeah. Yes. And then another just musical vignette of perhaps first the breakdown of communication, if you would like to come back up. We will just jump right into it. And yes, obviously, one of us played the right notes, and one of us, me, did not. And this is analogous in my mind to, you know, we can come prepared to have a discussion and to hopefully find perhaps a solution to something difficult. But if one of us does their homework and one of us doesn't, if we come with incorrect information, if we haven't actually bothered to know if what we are holding on to and believing and saying is grounded in reality, then again, like having the conversation is not only useless, it's taking us backwards. And that is definitely not the goal when we attempt to converse. And if you have anything to add, feel free to jump in. But again, a very just overt reminder of, you know, let's be very careful as we do engage over difficult things when there is a lot at stake and we are caring so much about trying to find an answer. Let's be equally caring about doing our homework and doing our research in advance. That could go a long way in just helping to come together. And for a third little example, I'll let you introduce that.
So a kind of third example that has some of the characteristics of what we've already illustrated is to imagine a kind of now a situation in which the two people involved can hear each other and they have, in some sense, prepared for what's going to happen, but one of them is very resistant, really, to what the other person is trying to say or express, and is pretty dogged about it, really. And but in the course of 3 iterations of this short passage, that person picks up something, is persuaded, if you like, by the way in which the other person is behaving, and perhaps by the end they've reached some sort of more, I don't know, some more accommodating and certainly more flexible kind of relationship. So, I mean, these are all, as you can see, in some sense they are rehearsed versions of what might happen more spontaneously in both music making and life. But all three of them, we felt, were ways of showing how the kind of dynamics of musical interaction bring into play many of the same kinds of broadly speaking, psychological attributes and kind of social dynamics that are involved in the rest of life. So, and I suppose what we want to do over the next sort of 15 to 20 minutes now is to have a bit of a conversation with the two of us about some of those matters and invite you to kind of, as it were, think along with us, and we will make sure that we leave some time before the final section of performances, in which we would be very glad to hear your comments and questions and so on. So, where should we start? I suppose we could start with this. We could start with listening itself. There are various ways that we might think about listening to sounds in general, musical sounds and the sounds of the environment. And one distinction that I think, and which I have written about myself in some of my own academic work, one distinction that I think can be really interesting in thinking about the kind of listening that we have just been demonstrating, as it were, which you have been witnessing, is the distinction between listening to sounds, the sounds themselves, and on the one hand, and on the other, listening to what those sounds are the sounds of. And sounds can be the sounds of all kinds of things. They are, of course, in some sense, the sounds of the material objects that have produced those sounds, and they are the sounds of the people who have activated those material objects. And they are even, going to a slightly more abstract sense of the sound of, they are the sounds of the intentions of those people that have activated those materials. And those intentions will encompass their kind of aesthetic intentions and their emotional intentions, and generalizing this to everyday life, as it were, they generalize out towards people's, social intentions and perhaps the ways in which they are trying to accommodate people or manipulate people or whatever. And so I think it's really interesting to think about when musicians are listening to one another, what are they listening to? So Jessica, I think I'd be interested to know what you think about this distinction between listening to the sounds themselves, what some philosophers call the qualia of sound, those qualities, the sonic qualities of sound, versus listening to something that, in a sense, lies behind those sounds.
I think that when coming together, for instance, in the duo, there are several levels of listening. There's just the very basic level of paying attention to timing and trying to make sure that rhythmic things are lined up. There's also the attribute of intonation that we're listening for and trying to match. That's kind of one level of things I'm listening for. And then on another level, there's the emotional intent. What emotion is being conveyed by my duet partner? What are they trying to say and express? How am I feeling about the music, and what am I trying to add to this conversation, and how can we bring those two things together?
Yeah. And in terms of, let's think about how that might relate to what happens when we're having a conversation. Here we are having a conversation. I'm listening to the way in which you are just expressing your thoughts, and you're listening. And I suppose in the same sort of way, I'm both aware of your voice and accent and articulation, and also hearing something about what it is that you are putting, what thoughts you're putting into those words, and what intention you're trying to convey to people who come to hear us.
Right, and I think that's listening for the intention, bringing our attention to the intention of the other, I think is vital both in music, but especially, in life, because words are unwieldy things at times, and sometimes even when we have the best intentions, we aren't always choosing the words that best express what we are trying to say. And so having you as an empathetic listener to hear past perhaps the word itself, to realize I might not have chosen the right word to convey what I'm attempting to express, and then to be willing to ask me, for instance, I think we were talking about this a little bit in a slightly different context the other day, but I'll bring it in now. Intentions and finding words that line up with our emotion or with our train of thought even, so much hangs on definitions. And being willing to take the time to understand what the other is truly meaning by their use of a word. For instance, I was having a conversation with a lovely woman, and we were discussing the concepts of joy and happiness. And we came to realize that we were using the word in polar opposite ways. Her definition of joy was something fleeting, transient, kind of shallow, and her definition of happiness was the opposite. Well, whereas I have the opposite construction. What was interesting was we both agreed that the idea of something that was deep and lasting and unshakable by circumstances, that was the most important thing. But we came to realize we used opposite words to express that. And so because we both took the time and had the intention to understand, we came to realize that whereas if we had only gone by the word itself and the label, we would have thought we were completely at odds. And so I think that's a very basic thing and concept, but when we're then engaging in the difficult issues, whether personal or political or in whatever sphere, to really take even extra time these days when labels and definitions of things have come to mean perhaps way more than they used to, and so we don't even know what the other person might be intending by the use of a certain term. So I think that we need to take time.
I think this is one of the things that in our discussions before this event that seemed to come out, that one of the things that musical engagement can afford, it doesn't always, but that it can afford, is this process of kind of mutual investigation of people, as you say, taking the time to find out what is it you're trying to do with your music and how can I fit my music with it. I mean, one of the contexts in which I have certainly experienced that in really interesting and sometimes quite highly revealing ways is actually in improvised music making. You came and heard from me and some other people improvising actually here 2 or 3 weeks ago, and Bruno, my improvising colleague, is up there in the audience. And certainly in that kind of free improvisation where something happens out of nowhere sometimes, I mean literally out of nowhere, in the sense that when we start some of these improvisations we have no idea where we're starting from or necessarily where we're going to. When something happens, perhaps, and when one is, just with instrument in hand, then the only way and the obvious way, in a sense, to try and find out, well, what is going on and what do you mean, is to play, literally, to play with that person. And this kind of playfulness, this sense of the possibility of an investigative and curious kind of mindset, and a way of saying, kind of, is it this or is it this, or how does this work with it, or what are you going to do if I do this in relationship to it, and so on. I mean, I think clearly within the rather unconstrained circumstances of free improvisation, that can be both quite a risky and also quite a radical kind of investigation. Given that most of your music making is more from written music, how do you see that working in the same way with music that is in some sense rather more specified, but still there's of course an enormous amount of leeway open to you just to work with a musical partner and think, how should we do it? Like this, like that.
Well, what you were just saying, it made me think of a concept that I call the performance mentality versus the rehearsal mentality. And I think that when we come into difficult conversations and are trying to solve something that is important to us, to the world, we can often come to it with a performance mentality as if it's a one-shot option. And we either succeed or we fail, and we bring so much pressure then, and I think that pressure obscures our ability to listen. But, as you were just describing, in a rehearsal, or in improv, but even in rehearsal of, as you said, the printed music, we have the space for grace, as I call it, to try something, to go back and do it again. No, that wasn't it. Try it again. But did you really mean to play it that way? And to really kind of have that kind of unwritten contract that it's okay to take a risk and to mess up. It's not the performance. We're going to have a chance to do it again. And I think if we can bring that mentality to our conversations, to realize this stuff is hard. Even talking about non-controversial issues can be difficult. You know, when you have to really sort through the definition of just joy and happiness, like, let's, you know, imagine something that's actually controversial. It's going to be all the more difficult. And so maybe cultivating the idea that when I come into a conversation with you about something that we disagree about, that we can go back and I can say, hold on, can you maybe say that a different way? And you say to me, I didn't understand.
And actually, interestingly, interestingly, the phrase to rehearse the arguments for this, that, or the other is a phrase that we use, and in a sense, I've sometimes thought, is that a slightly kind of fussy way of describing it? But actually, I think there is something really, really strong and good about that, which is that indeed a person might say, well, let me rehearse the arguments for, Brexit, let's say, or something. Take one of these kind of rather polarizing things. Let me rehearse the arguments. And what one, I think, is saying through using that language is to say, I'm going to try these arguments out on you. I'm going to do it with presumably with the best will in the world. And they may completely fall flat, and that's going to be a useful thing to say. It's like saying, I'm going to try playing boom, bum, boom, bum, boom, 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 just like this. And let's see what happens, and it either works or it doesn't work. And then presumably one says, well, okay, I've rehearsed the arguments, or I have rehearsed the part, and it's just not working. And we go away and try something different.
Right. And in that sense of not working, that dissonance of ideas, I think what you touched on is something very important, that we need to have space for a dissonance of ideas. The goal isn't to agree all the time. we wouldn't grow. We wouldn't find solutions if we're just all of one mind. But to create a space where I bring an idea, you bring a different idea, and one of us might be right and one of us might be wrong, and to acknowledge the fact that that's okay to have a superiority of ideas. We can both still have an equality of personhood.
Yeah.
And I think that is also something to really hold on to in this day of polarization, where there are so many differences of opinion clashing. We can have definitive ideas about things and our agreement or disagreement with a set idea, and we can still hold on to the humanity of the person who holds the opposite.
Yeah.
And I think it's only from that grounding of common humanity that we can hope to have a discussion where ideas can come into play, and then the ones that aren't going to be helpful can be discarded.
Yeah.
And if we don't, if we're made to be too afraid to actually state something that we believe, then we never have a chance to find out if there's value or not.
So can we think of a way in which musical practice, musicking, gives us a way of dealing with those profoundly negative circumstances where we experience, a person's hate or anger or negativity towards us, and as we've been observing in the world, certainly over the last year or two, and arguably for very much longer than that, that the response to that of hate against hate is clearly extraordinarily destructive. Simply turning away and doing nothing about it, and kind of turning your back on it and saying, well, if you hate me so much, I'm going to have nothing to do with you. Arguably also leaves us in a very undeveloping situation. Are there ways? Can we see ways in which musicking offers us a way of dealing with negativity in a productive way?
Well, maybe to take a slightly different angle to that question, thinking about the anger and hatred that can be so at the fore these days, thinking about the emotion that is so bound up, both in conversation and that is bound up in performance if we're really engaging in it as musicians. I think that music can be a very healthy space for those emotions to be explored and expressed and felt deeply in a way that we can grapple with those emotions ourselves. And, in a scenario where we might have been, overtly attacked by someone for holding a particular idea, music can offer a space to truly grapple, but then to do that, as I said, within ourselves and not responding and reacting and attacking back.
Some people have suggested that. I think Ian Cross, who was Professor of Music in Cambridge until fairly recently when he, like I, retired, has written about music and biocultural evolution and suggests that, amongst many ways in which people have argued for as it were, for the adaptive importance of music in human cultures, is that it offers a kind of safe space in which to try out, if you like, in inverted commas, try out ways of being that in direct human interaction are risky. That if I say, well, let's try being really angry with one another in reality, then it may kind of, it may shade over into physical violence and stuff like that. Whereas, arguably, what music allows us to do is to come into contact with these powerful, not emotional, but not only emotional, kind of virtual circumstances, you might say, and to experience what those might be like, and to learn to kind of roll with those punches, or better still, to learn to grow with them. And I suppose one of the kinds of emotional circumstance that a lot of people seem to seek out in music is actually an experience of sorrow or grief. There is the well-known phenomenon that large numbers of people, large proportion of the population actively seeks out so-called sad music or sorrowful music. I always think that sad music is such a shallow way of expressing it, but I think we know what that means. Music that makes us feel deeply moved and possibly deeply moved to tears, but in a way that is somehow powerful and strong and developing. And one way to understand that, I suppose, is to think, well, this is a way of, we are all going to die, and this is a way of starting to learn what it is like to witness the death of another, and perhaps to start to think about our own deaths through an encounter with some very big but difficult to accommodate emotional state.
Yes, and as you're saying, music does so well explore the depths of sorrow and the heights of joy. And speaking to the sorrow aspect, I think it gives us that permission that perhaps is not quite so culturally granted, not as culturally granted as it should be, I believe, because grief is a very real part of the human experience, and perhaps the lead that music takes can also give us a pathway to, as you're saying, not only contemplate it, but to like be with each other in the grief, and to not be afraid of it, and not be afraid to bring up something that's difficult or uncomfortable, but to become comfortable with the discomfort in a way that helps us support each other.
So in a sense also, I mean, as well as helping us to encounter these difficult circumstances, it also provides us with a way actually of experiencing a certain kind of solidarity. Both a solidarity, I mean, again, there is quite an extensive literature in which people talk about how, in some research, people talk about music being like their best friend. It's strange, the personification of music as a listener, strangely enough. That a piece of music can be listening to you rather than just speaking to you.
I've not thought of it in that way, actually. That's interesting.
Yes, there's really interesting research showing with people spontaneously coming up with that way of speaking. And I suppose in a kind of more obvious way, as has already been demonstrated by, so far, pairs of people, but which we'll see demonstrated by a trio of people quite soon, and even a quartet of people, and perhaps even a very larger. That when people make music together, of course, they also experience a particular kind of, rather, I mean, when it goes well, a really wonderful kind of solidarity. Well, it's a kind of liquidarity. Solidarity, a very flexible solidarity in which one both experiences support and flexibility and leader-follower and all of those. And again, there is lots of research, including by people in this university, showing how that kind of making music together, singing and playing music of any kind, produces powerful socially bonding and empathic and affiliative and so on relationships between the people involved, and even with people who are witnessing it in others, that the demonstration of that kind of solidarity can be, in a sense, contagious for an audience.
And just one more thing, perhaps, to unpack on the emotion front. We were talking about how amazing music can be to bring out the emotion within us, and certainly performance needs to be fueled by an emotion if it's going to be alive and real. But in our conversations, actually, I think emotion can be one of the very things that gets in our way. And I feel like we're at a moment when emotions quickly flare to a high as soon as a certain topic of division comes up. And I think for us to be able to engage, we need to be able, in the conversational context, to kind of recognize when that emotion is mounting that might preclude me from hearing what you have to say. And to then, in the spirit of practice, start to really tune into when that happens, rein it in, really try to listen and not allow emotion to become a negative fueler, but keeping it as a positive force.
I noticed that our 20 minutes or so have galloped past, as is always the case in conversation, and I would really like to hear some things from yours. So just to kind of draw this conversation to a close, I mean, when Jessica first suggested that we might do this event, I think the thing that really struck me actually is actually summarized within that notion of the distinction between a performance culture and a rehearsal culture. And I do think that is a really potentially quite a powerful image to think, our culture is so full of the performativity of life that, here we are in a sense performing a conversation, which is, we are really having this conversation, but we're also performing it. And when we came onto the stage, I performed, as it were, being the Emeritus Professor of Music at Oxford, in order to do that kind of thing, and you performed being Jessica Miskelly, the violinist, as opposed to Jessica Miskelly, the person who cooked a very lovely meal yesterday. So there is a sense in which that performativity is important to recognise, but I think there is a real danger that performance takes over the incredibly valuable way in which we could, and how refreshing it might be if we had a rehearsal culture in which we were always trying things out and never had anything settled. Yeah.
I think that that rehearsal idea, it gives us space to, as you're saying, try out these things, but also, even if we were to successfully kind of implement this rehearsal mentality, there is still, in everyday real life, a sense of risk. Especially if there has been, perhaps, a rupture between two people, whether personal or professional realms, doesn't matter. That first step of coming together feels risky.
Yeah.
Even if we know the other person is willing to listen and will likely say, I forgive you, if it's a context where I need to apologize.
Yeah.
I think it still takes courage to take the first step towards the possibility of reconciliation. And just to quickly end with reflection about Bach's music, when Bach is writing in his third partita, double stops. Two of the intervals that come up very frequently are the second and the seventh, and they're two of the most dissonant, kind of nails on the chalkboard interval that we have. And yet, both of those intervals are one step away from a coming together and a harmony. And I think that the interval of the second is kind of like analogous to those people closest to us, family, friends, the colleagues we deal with every day. And that interval of the seventh is kind of analogous to those people who are so different from us, who come from a background we can't even imagine. And it can feel like there's such an impossibility of coming together, and yet, really, we're only one step away. So,
right. So, not to frustrate you any longer, please, yes.
Thank you for a wonderful conversation. I wonder if I might ask you to comment on the relationship, if any, between literature and music. So one of the great writers about writing, Alan Garner, describes the job of an author as being to transmit the story in as pure and as undistorted a way as possible. So a good author is one who gets out of the way of the story. And he says that the real act of creation occurs not on the author's laptop, but when the reader reads the text on the page and transmutes it into something really magic. So I wondered if you thought there was any parallel between that process and the musical process. So is the author in Alan Garner's model like the performer as he perceived it? And a perhaps related question, you haven't said much about the role of the composer. Does a performer have a duty, and if so, what sort of duty?
Oh, we could be going to disagree violently here. Let's see.
Well, I was going to allow you to have the lead on that to answer, and then I'll follow up.
Okay, well, I think thinking about music, I'm not going to say musicology because that rather pigeonholes it, but thinking about music, I think, has emerged from a long period in which the composer, indeed, what the composer specified and what we might imagine the composer wanted, has enormously held sway over what performers should be doing. And as a result of quite a lot of literature, perhaps the most significant and the most often cited is a book by Christopher Small called Musicking. There has been something of a sea change of understanding that performers are not just the kind of passive channels for the composer's great thought, but are themselves involved in that transformative creative process. and that there should be and must be room for those performers' voices, literally and metaphorically, to be heard. And I think I feel that has been a tremendously liberating thing for performers. But I do think that there is something also really powerful about the kind of negotiation of those two sources of creative activity. And that a performer, I mean, in the case of, again, to go back to free improvisation just very briefly, in the case of free improvisation, there is no back there kind of authority to whom those improvisers are beholden. So in a sense, they are completely free. And one of the criticisms of free improvisation, Pierre Boulez, for instance, was a radical critic of improvisation, because he said all too often it sounded just as though people kind of fell into their own sort of habits and grooves and so on. All you heard was the performer's habits coming through. And I think there is something, can be something really interesting and, if you like, virtuous about that sort of agonistic relationship between the forces that come from the written music. In a way, I'd rather keep it to the written music rather than the composer, because we know so little about what the composer may or may not have been thinking about when they put the notes on the page. But there is the stuff on the page, and that stuff on the page is a set of forces, and what I want to do with it is another set of forces, and that negotiation between the two can be really exciting.
I couldn't have said it better. I can't offer, a really antagonistic rebuttal, because I actually agree with you.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
At the back.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting, and I think a really hopeful way of thinking about our public dialogue. And one of the things I was reflecting on is I work in the civil service, and there's been a lot of talk this week about the civil service sitting in a tepid bath of managed decline, and what might be leading to that. And one of the issues, I think, is that a lot of the complex problems that we're dealing with are sort of take a number of departments working together, or they take politicians, civil servants, a number of states working together. But the problem is our public context often expects people to have a particular view. There's an election. The government is elected to deliver a particular thing, and then departments set out to deliver that. And I'm really aware when we talk across government that nobody's listening to anybody. Actually, departments are trying to deliver something set. So I wonder if there's, this could really improve public dialogue if there was more of a rehearsal context in the media. And I just wonder if that's possible, what your reflections are, how can we do that and listen to each other better in public?
I wonder if actually what would be helpful is a cultural shift. I'm going out on a limb here. A cultural shift in journalism that isn't actually looking for the most provocative take on something, but is actually a culture of journalism that is wanting to support the possibility of working together. Right now, I think we're often within media so view-driven that the antagonism is what is gaining clicks, and perhaps we can be part of the solution by, first of all, not being part of the click. Sometimes I will, as I'm scrolling through, I'll see something really provocative and I will not click on it. I'm just refusing to give them, to fall to the bait, if you will. And so that's just a brief reflection, but it's something I've been thinking of too, because I think that oftentimes the headlines get in our way.
Yeah. And perhaps, this sounds absurdly idealistic in some ways, but perhaps there is room for there to be sort of, in some simple sense of the word, music-based listening workshops in such places. After all, a good friend of mine from university set up a company. She was an actor for the first part of her professional career. She then set up a company which used to go into into other companies to give people kind of confidence and presentational training, as it were, based on her acting skills. Well, you know, if musicians went into places like this and said, look, we need to have people listen to each other better, let's do a bit of, you know, singing of some rounds together in which you have to listen to each other to know where to come in and so on. You know, it doesn't matter whether the result is at all successful musically in the sense, but it would definitely induce people to see that listening was important. You had a question, yes?
Yes, thank you. This is really, really enjoyable. And there's two things that have been bouncing around in my head as I've been listening to all of this, various things, the topics that have been coming up. The first one is sort of the difference between what music is as communication and what language is as communication. And then secondly, and I think very related to it, the nature of music is not only something that's listened to or is intended to be received by listeners, but something that's received in a whole body way that has to do with the full experience of embodiment. And there's this sense in which, you know, I was actually thinking of the first example of when you all were playing, you had the earphones on. There was something else going on as well. It wasn't just that you weren't listening. You also weren't looking at each other. And you weren't perceiving each other's movements. And I wondered if even with the earphones and the earplugs on, you could have actually had some sort of unity of sound. There are some limitations to that, of course, in terms of like the dynamic, for instance. But there is something about music that is immediate. It's not mediated in the way that language is. Language, of course, you have words, you have the meaning of words, the multivalence of how it's said and what it means. But music is immediate. Dennis Turner, for instance, says that music is like pure rhetoric. It's there. There's sort of a whole body experience of it. So I think if I were to put that into a question, the first question is how does music teach us about what communication is and how we can overcome things in regard to conflict that language can't do, or the sort of spokenness can't do. And what would you say in regard to music? I think especially in my mind, I'm thinking about the pandemic as something which forced us online and away from embodied engagement with people. What might music teach us about that? Maybe that's related as well to music.
Yeah, sure. I think it'd be wrong to think that music was only immediate. There are certainly very immediate aspects of music, but one only needs to encounter the music of a radically other culture to witness just how difficult it can be to penetrate in all but some of the broader things. I remember the first time I ever heard a Japanese gamelan orchestra at a concert in London. It was a gamelan orchestra with dancers, and for the first half of this event, I could sort of see the dancers moving, and I really almost literally couldn't really hear the music, or I could make very little sense of it. But even by the second half of that concert, something had sort of changed. So I think it'd be wrong to think that you know, music had universal, immediate appeal. But there is something, as you say, whole body about it. There is something even more. I mean, you know, some language performances can be quite whole body. If you think about, you know, incredible actors delivering then you know, I, as many of us, I'm sure in this audience, I've been, you know, in tears at Shakespeare's soliloquies or whatever, you know, that where the sense, the power of the word and the whole body delivering that can be very strong. But I suppose, you know, the physicality of musical production in all but digitally produced music is an incredibly powerful thing, and I do think that, and because we, broadly speaking, all share very similar bodies, whatever, you know, even under situations of disability, we are still endowed with very similar bodies, with very similar attributes. I think there is an extremely powerful underlying, kind of almost biologically based sense of that immediacy and that kind of communication. Sorry, there was a second question that you asked that I take.
Just, you know, the connection between sort of what is music, how is music able to overcome limits of spoken language? Yeah.
Well, I suppose it is through that strongly bodily. It's something about presence as well, because what you said about the pandemic, about, you know, there were quite a lot of people who then joined online choir, who had been in choirs, who joined online choirs, and they said it's an awful lot better than nothing, but it's really not like being in the same room. I mean, the same thing is true of speech, of course. It's always much nicer to be in a space like this with you. If you were all thumbnails on a Zoom call, I don't think we would be having as much fun as I am.
Any other last questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll try to keep it quick, but I'm not good at brevity. Does music, or at least this kind of music, perhaps have a problem that our communication also has, that we might get to the point where it won't help us, and that is much of music was meant to be performed, for instance, in church settings, and isn't anymore. Just like much art was meant to be displayed in a drawing room, and now it's in a giant museum. And conversation also, when we talk about it nowadays, we almost talk about it abstracted from the interests and communities and persons and histories and things like that. We have to do it to analyze it, but in fact we have conversations nowadays, almost global conversations, that are by their nature separated out from any individual community. We also have music that, because of the way we can represent it on the page and print it and reproduce it, and because there's a whole culture of bespoke music rooms and ways that it's appreciated in entire educational apparatuses. Do we have a problem here of not only a disembodied, but a completely free-floating system in music of a certain kind and in conversation that would have to be grounded in a certain way ever to get past techniques to improve maybe, and to get to something, I think which Jessica suggested earlier, something more like seeing the other person as a person, not only that, but as a friend, as a potential friend, as a member of a body that I'm part of, or said differently, the old idea of like the imago Dei, of all being children of the same God, for instance, puts you in the same status to one another, but it is a specific kind of claim. It's almost a confessional kind of claim.
Yes, I think that if I am encapsulating this correctly, and correct me if not, but I do think that the challenges between these broad global conversations that are fueled by social media, etc., and perhaps music, if too far removed from a more intimate setting, there are similar challenges, and we must, I think, seek to have that more rooted and connected space, whether, in, like, I love this room in particular, because yes, it's a concert hall, but it's so much smaller and more intimate, and the audience and the performer don't feel so disconnected and other.
Yeah.
We're just here all together. How that can be achieved in the cultural sphere, I think that there isn't going to be an easy solution or an institutional solution, but I think that for me, like, part of my motivation in showing up tonight and trying to do something that's out of the box and different is to leave here with a sense that we have more agency, actually, than we are made to feel by things like media, etc., where we're often told division is insurmountable and it's only growing and looking to, top-down solutions, rather than feeling empowered in my daily life, in the choice I make today, in how I deal with you in rehearsal, in how in that choice to kind of collect my emotion and not let it overpower and attack and become something hurtful. Like, there is great power in those choices, and I think that collectively, if we are each doing that, the collective has a chance. And I think if we can have the courage to believe, actually, that we can make a difference, like, that's a first small step.
I think that's a great moment as well. Okay, not a great moment, but thank you so much for that, because I think, that's a great concept, yeah. Ben.
I'm wondering, reflecting on this, well, the question earlier that you were responding to about the competition that same thing of the ability to demonstrate that with the same piece being played 2 or 3 times in either in those traditions or actually another one that comes to mind is if you take something like Beethoven's like Sonata, there's a great schism between popular music and classical music. Well, listening to that being played on a piano is one thing, listening to that being played on an electric guitar in heavy metal is a very different, it's a virtuosic piece of guitar music. And yet again, the metalhead and the classical music lover would seem to have nothing in common.
And yet
those notes exemplify the greatest of one sort and the greatest of the other sort.
Yes, and I think although the internet has its problems in the kind of flattening of culture, one might say, in certain ways, but one of the huge kind of democratizing and, in a sense, mind-opening things that has happened with music on the internet is simply the availability of being able, going back to your Bach examples, that one, rather than, in my parents' generation, people typically owned, one LP copy of a piece of music. They would never have, they'd be unlikely that they would have more than one recording of it. And as a child, certainly, I can remember growing up to know a piece of music by virtue of the recording that my parents happened to have, or whatever. And I think that the availability of hearing huge numbers of recordings sort of opens up those very possibilities. And rather than having to say, oh, I don't like Oistrakh, I like Podger, you can like Podger and Oistrakh type of thing, and have those all available, and to see how there is that incredibly flexible relationship between those two things. Yeah. Perhaps one. we can't go on like this. Yeah.
Can I just follow up on that point? I don't know if people are familiar with Caroline Shaw, but she won the Pulitzer Prize for composition in America, and she's taken 2 pieces of music, ABBA, Lay All Your Love on Me, and translated that to marimbas and voice, and she's also taken Schubert to music and slowed it right down. And in a way, what I think is what you're saying, and what this conversation is about, is interpreting music and the composer's notes can actually create greater understanding if you do something patiently and lovingly with it. So I encourage you to go onto YouTube and look at Caroline Shaw to music and Now You'll Love Me, because it brings new understanding of what was a very pop song into something where the grief is clearly represented. And what she does with Schubert, I find remarkable. I think Schubert would appreciate it.
Right. Yeah.
So I think the listening and what you're saying is, if it helps us understand things better and understand each other better, that is the gift of both music and the ways we interpret it.
Okay, very last. That was it. That was the very last. No, one more, sorry.
I just wanted to ask, so in public discussions there seems to be a kind of tendency that there is a disharmony if you're disagreeing with someone to decide for them to leave the discussion and to not be part of the kind of discourse anymore. And I wonder, in your experience in playing and doing music with others, or in orchestras or different kinds of group settings, what has there been experience with people, there being disharmony in the interaction between musicians and in the playing, and what has that disharmony been, and why have people left, what have made people maybe shun each other, or not wanting to do music together anymore?
Well, there are famous stories about certain quartet members who would never speak to each other outside of rehearsal, but would only come together over top of great differences and make music. And yes, it is a common thing for groups to fall apart because the unfortunate fact that the disagreements can't be transcended in particular cases, which is, both a breakdown of the music making, but more importantly, a breakdown of the interpersonal communication And so sometimes it is not possible for people to find resolution. But to just perhaps end on this note, resolution will not always be possible, even when we bring our best intentions to the table. But if we don't take the risk of trying, then we will never have a resolution. You know, we're not going for 100%, we're going for an improvement. And I think that is the hope that we can take away, not an overly optimistic, unrealistic idea that, oh, okay, if we listen better, there is 100% chance of everything being resolved. No, I can't say that and be honest, but I think that we have such an opportunity at this juncture in our world at this moment to bring the best of our listening to the table and to believe that actually we can have agency and we can make a difference.
Thank you very much indeed for your very good questions. And now we will move on to part 3, where we will definitely witness some great listening.
So that will be the intention. Now, in the spirit of rehearsal rather than performance, I really want to know what time it is because I have no idea how much time we have left.
It's close to 9, so we've been going for an hour and a quarter.
Okay.
But, yeah.
So, shall we make some music for you all and perhaps be a little bit flexible?
Yeah.
We might knock a movement or two off the program for the courtesy of time.
And we have intended that we will end with a well-known shaker tune called Simple Gifts, the text for which is in your program. And we will start, when we get to that point, by playing it instrumentally, but would strongly encourage and invite you to sing.
Don't give it away! I mean, come on. Yes, there will be audience participation. But at this moment, I am delighted to welcome Jessica back to play some Mozart for you. We are going to do the rondo from his duo in G major. Hope you enjoy it. you have a heads up, is going to require your participation. What we're going to do is, well, your voluntary participation. We are going to end with a very simple and beautiful melody, simple gifts, which will be familiar to most of us. The words are conveniently printed in your program if you would like to join in. You might need a magnifying glass, sorry about that.